Okay, I'm reading an impossible Barbri outline that I'm going to start on page 89. This is for contracts and sales, and where we are at in the discussion right now is discharging an absolute duty to perform, which happens under 13 different occurrences, actually more like 14, 15. So I'm just going to, at a high level, describe what they are. Discharge by performance, discharge by tender of performance, discharge by occurrence of condition subsequent, discharge by illegality, discharge by impossibility, impracticability, or frustration. Each one discussed further. Part performance, prior to impossibility, dash quasi-contractual recovery, which is applicable if there's part performance prior to an impossibility. There's some specific situations when an absolute duty to perform is discharged, and that includes A, death or physical incapacity, B, supervening illegality, C, subsequent destruction of contract subject matter or means of performance. There's no D, apparently. There's discharge by impracticability. Discuss further. Discharge by frustration, discuss further. And the sixth manner in which we discharge an absolute duty to perform is discharge by rescission. There's partial discharge by modification of contract. As discharge by novation, discharge by cancellation, discharge by release, discharge by substituted contract, and discharge by accord and satisfaction. Discharge by account stated, which I started getting hung up in satisfaction and accord and account stated. But before I elaborate, let me finish with saying discharge by lapse and effect of running your statute of limitations. So, going back to satisfaction and accord. An accord taken alone will not discharge the prior contract. It merely suspends the right to enforce it in accordance with the terms of the accord contract. And at this point, I forget what accord stands for. That is an agreement in which one party to an existing contract agrees to accept in lieu of the performance that she is supposed to receive from the other party to the existing contract some other different performance. So there's the requirement of consideration. There's cases in which there's a partial payment of the original debt. And like I said, this will suspend the right to enforce the contract. Satisfaction is the performance of an accord agreement. Its effect is to discharge not only the original contract, but also the accord contract as well. Effect of breach of accord agreement before satisfaction. What happens when the accord agreement is not followed by an immediate satisfaction and one of the parties breaches the accord agreement. 1 discusses the breach by the debtor of an accord agreement before satisfaction, and 2 is a breach by the creditor. If there's a breach by the debtor, if the breach is by the debtor, the creditor may sue either on the original undischarged contract or for breach of the accord agreement. If the breach is by the creditor, he sues on the original contract. The debtor has 2 courses of action available, A and B. A, she may raise the accord agreement as an equitable defense and ask that the contract action be dismissed. Or B, as an alternative, she may wait until she is damaged. For example, the creditor is successful in his action on the original contract and then bring an action at law for damages for breach of the accord contract. D discusses checks tendered as payment in full. And this is really kind of coming out of nowhere under the discharge by accord and satisfaction. I think it has something to do with partial payment that we discussed before. If a monetary claim is uncertain or is subject to a bona fide dispute, an accord and satisfaction may be accomplished by a good faith tender and acceptance of a check when that check or an accompanying document conspicuously states that the check is tendered in full satisfaction of the debt. And this is found in the UCC section 3-311. The 13th means in discharging an absolute duty to perform is discharged by account stated. And an account stated is a contract between parties whereby they agree to an amount as a final balance due from one to the other. This final balance encompasses a number of transactions between the parties and serves to merge all of these transactions by discharging all claims owed. In other words, all rights as to the individual original transaction are discharged and the new agreement is enforceable. For an agreement to qualify as an account stated, the parties must have had more than one prior transaction between them. Writing the generally is not required. That the account for a discharge by account stated. However, if one or more of the original transactions was subject to the statute of frauds, a writing will usually be required. And the account may be implied under account stated, so it is also not required that an account stated be express. It may be implied. And since that's difficult to conceive, there's an example. Cindy and Dave have entered into a number of transactions. Cindy presents Dave with a bill for $1,000 covering all of these previous transactions. Dave does not object to this amount within a reasonable period of time. It will be held that there is an account stated. Okay. Discharged by lapse as a, again, making sure I'm saying this right. Repetition goes a long way. Discharge by lapse of an absolute duty to perform. Where the duty of each party is a condition concurrent to the other's duty, it is possible that on the day set for performance, neither party is in breach and their contractual obligations lapse. The time when the lapse becomes effective. This is described as if the contract states that time is of the essence, the lapse will occur immediately. Otherwise, the contract will lapse after a reasonable time. An example is being provided. Sally contracts with Bobby to sell 100 widgets to her for $1,000 on November 15th. On November 15th, Sally does not tender the widgets and Bobby does not tender the $1,000. 10 months afterwards, Sally attempts to put Bobby in breach by tendering the widgets. Sally will not have a claim as the contractual obligations of both parties have been discharged by lapse. And last, the effect of running of statute of limitations. If the statute of limitations on an action has run, it is generally held that an action for breach of contract may be barred. Note, however, that only judicial remedies are barred. The running of the statute does not discharge the duties. Hence, if the party who has the advantage of the statute of limitations subsequently agrees to perform, new consideration will not be required. Okay, we're moving into section 7, finally, of this outline titled Breach. When does a breach occur? If it is found that I, the promisor, is under an absolute duty to perform, and Roman numeral 2, this absolute duty of performance has not been discharged, then this failure to perform in accord with contractual terms will amount to a breach of the contract. The non-breaching party who sues for breach of contract must show that she is willing and able to perform, but for the breaching party's failure to perform. B. Material or minor breach, common law contracts. Once you have determined that there is a breach of contract, the next determination to be made in a common law contract situation is whether the breach is material or minor. Talking about the effect of breaches on page 91. We are starting with minor breach. A breach of contract is minor if the obligee gains the substantial benefit of her bargain despite the obligor's defective performance. Examples would be insignificant delays in completing performance for small deficiencies in the quality or quantity of performance when precision is not critical. The effect of a minor immaterial breach is to provide a remedy for the immaterial breach to the aggrieved party. The aggrieved party is not relieved of her duty of performance under the contract. Material breach. If the obligee does not receive the substantial benefit of her bargain as a result of failure to perform or defective performance, the breach is considered material. If the breach is material, the consequences are more severe. The non-breaching party, Roman numeral I, may treat the contract as at an end. For example, any duty of counter performance owed by her will be discharged, and Roman numeral 2 will have the immediate right to all remedies for breach of the entire contract, including total damages. Let's see, minor breach coupled with an anticipatory repudiation. If a minor breach is coupled with an anticipatory repudiation, the non-breaching party may treat it as a material breach. She may sue immediately for total damages and is permanently discharged from any duty of further performance. Indeed, the courts hold that the aggrieved party must not continue on, because to do so would be a failure to mitigate damages. The UCC modifies this to permit a party to complete manufacture of goods to avoid having to sell unfinished goods at the lower salvage value. Material breach of divisible contract. An indivisible contract recovery is available for substantial performance of a divisible part, even though there has been a material breach of the entire contract. Determining materiality of breach. In a divisible contract, recovery is available for substantial performance of a divisible. Determining the materiality of the breach, the general rule is whether a breach is material or minor is a fact question. To make this determination, the courts generally apply the following 6 criteria, and this comes from the Restatement of Contracts, section 275. 1 out of 6, look of amount of benefit received. Look to the extent to which the non-breaching party will receive substantially the benefit she could have anticipated from full performance. The greater the extent, the less material the breach. 2 out of 6, adequacy of damages. Look to the extent to which the injured party may be adequately compensated in damages. The greater the extent, the less material the breach. 3. Extent of part performance. Look to the extent the party failing to perform completely has already performed or made preparations to perform. The greater the extent, the less material the breach. So, I feel that this is rather important when it comes to answering questions about damages. So, again, this is determining the materiality of a breach. You're looking at the amount of the benefit received, the adequacy of the damages, and the extent of the part performance. 4. Hardship to breaching party. 5. Negligent or willful behavior. And 6. Likelihood of full performance. Hardship to breaching party. Look to the extent of hardship on the breaching party should the contract be terminated. If a finding of materiality and termination of the contract would cause great hardship to the breaching party, the breach is less likely to be found to be material. Negligent or willful behavior. Look to the extent of negligent or willful behavior of the party failing to perform. The greater the extent, the more material the breach. 6. Likelihood of full performance. Look to the extent of likelihood the party who has failed to perform will perform the remainder of his contract. The greater the extent, the less material the breach. B, under determining materiality of breach, this comes after the general rule 1 through 6. B is the failure of timely performance. And C is material breach and substantial performance. So first, talking about a failure of timely performance. The basic question here is whether the parties to the contract must perform on time, assuming that the defaulting party had a duty to immediate performance when his failure to perform occurred. Then his failure to perform on time will always be a breach of contract. There are, however, additional specific rules for determining the materiality of breach by failure of timely performance. Those include 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, nature of contract or time of essence provision. 2, when the delay occurs. 3, mercantile contracts. 4, land contracts. And 5, availability of equitable remedy. Nature of contract or time of essence provision. Number 1. Unless the nature of the contract is such as to make performance on the exact day agreed upon of vital importance, for example, contract for use of a wedding chapel, or the contract by its terms provides that time is of the essence, failure by a promisor to perform at the stated time will not be material. Merely providing a date for performance does not make time of the essence. Time of the essence described in A. Traditionally, courts have held that if the contract contains a time is of the essence provision, any delay is a material breach of contract. The modern trend, however, is for the court to consider all of the circumstances, including the time of the essence clause, in determining whether performance at the time specified is important. For example, if the parties sign a pre-printed form contract that contains a time is of the essence clause and there are no surrounding circumstances indicating that performance on the date is of vital importance, a court could find that delayed performance is only a minor breach. See Restatement Second of Contract, Section 242C. When a delay occurs. Delay, this is 2 under failure of timely performance. Delay at the onset of performance before the delaying party has rendered any part of his agreed on performance is more likely to be considered material than delay where there has been part performance. Mercantile contracts' timely performance as agreed is important, and unjustified delay is material. In land contracts, more delay is required for materiality than in mercantile contracts. And lastly, availability of equitable remedy. In equity, the courts generally are much more lenient in tolerating considerable delay. Hence, they will tend to find the breach immaterial and award compensation for the delay where possible. See under this section, material breach and substantial performance. Whether performance is substantial depends on the quantity and quality of the performance. If the performance is substantial, the breach is not material. So the next section is C, the perfect tender rule under the sale of goods. And I think I'll just take a rest.